based on the discussions, which we will widely circulate to policymakers and other relevant stakeholders with the hope of informing policy and practice towards building a climate resilient African continent. And as Emanuela rightly stated, today we'll be exploring a very timely and important topic, the evolving role of oil and gas in shaping Africa's energy landscape, even as we confront pressing challenges posed by climate change, which we all know our continent is very vulnerable to. And we would also have the opportunity, of course, to delve into more detail of one of the ambitious energy initiatives on the continent in recent times, the Mission 300 Accelerator, spearheaded by the World Bank, the African Development Bank, and the Rockefeller Foundation, along with other development partners. This bold initiative aims to provide electricity access to 300 million people across Africa by 2030. And the question on the minds of many people is, how will this be delivered? And how can we all play a role to ensure that this project succeeds? Because it is in the interest of the continent that we are electrified to power our homes and to power economic good. So we are very glad to have the CEO of Mission 300 join us today. And we're going to start off the discussion with Mission 300. But let me now introduce our panelists, and we'll be doing justice to the subject. And first on my list, as they appear on my screen, is AB Clark. And AB is a senior investment and advisory professional with over 2 decades of experience at the intersection of energy, climate finance, and infrastructure development across Africa. He currently leads Frontier Alpha LLP, which I believe is based in Abuja, and where he advises governments, multilaterals, and private sector partners on sustainable energy policy, project design, and capital raising strategies. EB, great to have you, and thank you very much for your time. Okay.
Thank you very much. I wasn't sure I was meant to talk.
Yeah, okay. No, it's good to hear your voice. And next on my screen is Onyeka Okoye, and Onyeka is a development professional working at the nexus of energy access, development economics, policy optimization, and sustainability. He serves as program specialist at the Sustainable Energy for All, that is SEforALL, under the United Nations Office for Project Services. And in this role, he provides technical leadership for Anglophone distributed renewable energy programs and heads the facilities on clean cooking program. Onyeka, great to have you, and thank you very much for your time.
Thanks for having me, Seth. Happy to be here.
Great. And we do have 2 Andys here, but on my screen, it's actually Andrew Kamau. And Andrew is a distinguished energy leader with over 30 years of experience in the petroleum, mining, and energy sectors. He currently serves as the Managing Director, International Programs at the Energy Opportunity Lab, Center on Global Energy Policy at Columbia University in New York, USA. Andrew, great to have you, and good to see you again. Thank you very much for your time.
Thanks, Seth. We're still looking forward to your return visit.
Yes, it will surely happen. And then, of course, we have Andrew Herscowitz, who is the CEO of Mission 300 Accelerator. And Andy, as we mostly call him, is a globally recognized leader and organization builder, and most recently serving as the inaugural executive director of ODI Washington, and one of the world's leading global affairs think tanks. And proud to this, proud to ODI, and Andy spent more than 20 years of his time and work as one of US government's most senior development diplomats, having lived and worked on 4 continents. And Andy, great to have you. Thank you very much for making time for this discussion.
Thank you very much.
Okay. I think I'll start with you, and then panelists, at any particular point in time, you can jump in to chip in with a question for Andy. And of course, with our audience, you're always welcome to use the chat box to share your questions with us. But Andy, I mean, Mission 300...
You're Felix as well. You're Felix as well.
Oh, Felix is here. Okay, great. Sorry, I missed that. Hi, Felix. You're not showing on my screen. That's why I missed that. And
I'm happy to be here, Seth. That's okay.
Great. Okay, all right, sure.
Yeah.
And Felix is a senior.
little mix-up.
Yeah, no worries, but let me still do your introduction. So Felix is a senior policy officer in charge of research, oil and gas program at the African Energy Commission of the African Union, and he oversees energy policy development, advocacy, and technical support to AU member states in the oil and gas sector. So Felix, great to have you.
Thank you, Seth. I'm happy to be on this webinar.
Great. Andy, and back to you. So Mission 300, I think the mission is very clear and obvious. Electrify 300 million people across the continent. But to Mission 300, maybe for those who are not very familiar with the project, you can quickly tell us about it. But how does Mission 300 define energy assets? And so at what level of service or what minimum of service is considered sufficient to meet electricity access or energy access to Mission 300? Is it being able to power your electric bulb for 4 hours, 8 hours? How are you defining energy access?
So let's back up a Mission 300. Mission 300 is an unprecedented, ambitious effort that's being led by the African Development Bank and the World Bank to electrify 300 million Africans by 2030. And to give you some perspective, Power Africa, which I was a coordinator of for 7 years, over an 11-year period, it took, we were able to bring electricity access to about 200 million people over an 11-year period. So we're trying to do 300 million people in just about 5 years. Now we've learned a tremendous amount. Also with Power Africa, when you talk about what's the energy access level, we initially were counting solar lanterns, which when I realized that, I said, we need to stop doing this. So we never counted more than 20% of those connections as solar lanterns. Like you don't, count a bunch of people standing around a solar lantern as electricity access. But the World Bank does have this multi-tier way of measuring electricity access, with tier 1 being basic lighting, cell phone charging. Tier 2, it's slightly larger, some appliances. Tier 3, more productive appliances. You think like the type of power you get from mini grids. And then of course, grid power is tier 5. You've got to start somewhere, right? So nobody wants to say that if everyone gets tier 1 access, we're going to call it a day and that we've been successful. But you've got to start somewhere. And what you found, and the GOGLA, which is the Global Off-Grid Lighting Association, had done some research and it concluded that 78% of the 600 million people in Africa who don't have access to electricity can't even afford the $5 a month that's needed for a basic solar home system. So you have to start off with the idea of you've got to get people something and start with something and hope they work their way up the energy ladder. But our ultimate goal here is job creation and economic growth. So we're not satisfied with tier 1. We want to see people at tier 3 and above. We've got a major job creation, productive use program, economic transformation program, whatever you want to call it, all as a key part of the strategy of Mission 300. So we're driving for economic growth, but you got to start somewhere. And the reason you got to start somewhere is the World Bank's been doing grid expansion and grid densification for many, many years. And when you look at some of the research that they've done, even in countries like Kenya, or Ethiopia, where they've extended the grid, which is tier 5 access, a vast, significant number of the people are still only consuming at tier 1. So you've got there's like a lag time of 5 to 10 years between the time that people get access to electricity and their incomes increase and that they start consuming more electricity. So we're trying to like accelerate that as well. And that's not unique to Africa. That was the same thing in the US. One of my former colleagues, Katie Oth, who's with the Energy for Growth Hub, and she was the deputy coordinator for Power Africa with me. She just wrote a piece last week that looked at the US and saw that it was like decades before the economic growth caught up with the access, but they found that the communities that were connected first enjoyed economic growth far ahead of the communities that were connected later. So we have to start somewhere.
Great, interesting. So Mission 300, this is not the first time that Africa is having any kind of project, to electrify the continent. You spoke about Power Africa, the African Development Bank tried the New Deal on Energy for Africa. There's been scaling solar by IFC, or the back and other. How is this different from all others, right? And particularly with your ambitions over a period of 5 years to electrify 300 million people, while Power Africa, it took about 7 to 8 years to electrify 200 people. How is this different from the projects or programs we've already seen?
So it's different in a bunch of ways. First, the African Development Bank and the World Bank are making available $30 to $40 billion of concessional capital, IDA, African Development Fund money, concessional funding that's available to those IDA eligible countries so that they can, and it's double the amount, I think, that's been estimated that's ever been made available before. The other thing that's different is we've all learned a lot. You got some of the top people who've been working on energy access, working on this across Sustainable Energy for All, working across the Global Energy Alliance for People and Planet, the World Bank, African Development Bank, Rockefeller. But our network is far broader than that as well. So it's not like we're just working amongst ourselves, but we're talking to industry. We've seen the evolution of the solar home system market, what went right, what went wrong. We're seeing new business models like energy as a service emerging. You're seeing companies like Ignite, which started off doing solar home systems, providing energy as a service, where they get, instead of saying that you're going to pay a little bit each month for the solar home system and eventually own it, there's an agreement with the government that we will provide energy at a certain level to certain people, and you guarantee that we'll get payments. So there's all of these different models that have been working. Plus, costs are continue to come down as well. One of the things that we're doing is the IFC has been spearheading an effort to launch a vehicle, an equity vehicle called Project Zafiri. And what Zafiri is going to focus on is providing low-cost equity, basically. So there's going to be a junior tranche that Rockefeller Foundation's coming in as, and other foundations are coming in on, but to help the companies that are scaling mini grids scale more rapidly, cutting them checks between $5 million and $40 million, which allows them to do bulk procurement, which helps them bring down the cost. Always keep in mind, you've got that 78% of the people who can't afford the $5 a month. So we have to help them get their incomes up. We've got to get costs down and have them meet in the middle. And so that's what we're working to do, is try to bring down costs as much as possible, but also making sure that we're reducing the amount of subsidy that's necessary as well. There's other game changers that I think are happening in the market as well that we can talk about.
Now, you made mention of the fact that the World Bank is making available $30 billion, but I think your own estimates also indicates you require about $90 billion to be able to deliver by 2030, right? And of course, there's the IFC program as well. But what other funding instruments is the World Bank using, or are our development partners using, to be able to catalyze the private investment, which is very much needed to really scale up this project?
Yeah. So that concessional funding is an enabler for private sector to come in to help bring down costs as well. So you see other development finance institutions, multilateral development banks, like the Islamic Development Bank, the OPEC Fund for Development, the French AFD, others have come in, and BII have said that they're going to commit a certain amount of financing to make this work as well. But it's not just enough to commit the financing, because the financing needs projects to invest in. And what we have to do is help give incentives for that investment. And this is the role that philanthropy can play. This is what Rockefeller Foundation and GEOP are doing, is we're helping unstick projects. We're providing technical assistance that's needed to move projects forward. We're providing support to governments to help them pass the regulations that are needed. What's different about Mission 300 is you've got these bold government commitments that they announced through compacts. At the Africa Energy Summit that was held in Tanzania at the end of January, we had 25 heads of state do an all-Africa declaration in support of Mission 300. But even more importantly, we had 12 countries that entered into very, very detailed compacts of the reforms that they need to make in order to deliver on the connections. Plus, the African Development Bank and the World Bank have a collective list of 130 projects, either in their existing portfolio or in their pipeline, that when you add all of them up, if they're all completed by 2030, will get us to that 300 million number. So it's very, very real. But part of what we're doing as philanthropy is we're serving a bit as the glue and the grease to make sure that as obstacles come up, we can help fill those gaps. So there's technical assistance that the African Development Bank or World Bank can't provide. We can step in and do that.
Great. Now, one of the key things you would notice, or you probably have realized on our continent, is the fact that there is a wide gap between policy programs, policy ideas, and implementation, and really getting the result, right? So certainly comprehensive compacts on the countries. Then what next? What is next in terms of who does what, when, and how, right? And there will be.
Look, I'll be the first person to say that I think compacts are completely worthless if you don't have a plan for execution. So the very first thing that we did, was that, all right, you've got these compacts, but now how are you going to deliver on them? So we've asked each country to set up a compact delivery and monitoring unit. And we've all seen delivery units too that you spend a lot of money on, not empowered. But these compact delivery and monitoring units, they have to be empowered at the highest level within government, and they have to work across the ministries. Because it doesn't do you any good if the Minister of Energy wants to do something, but the Ministry of Finance says there's no money. So you've got to make sure the Ministry of Finance and the Ministry of Energy are aligned, and that the head of state or prime minister is saying, you all need to work together. These are the priorities. And then you need to take all of these commitments that they made for reforms, and you need to go through and analyze and prioritize, well, what are the ones that we really need to focus on to move the needle on electrical connections? Because a lot of them are nice, but you've got to really hone in on what's going to unstick the projects that are identified for that country. So right now we're in the process of having countries, and this does, let me be clear, none of this works if governments don't do their part. So this is 100, if you would say African Development Bank and World Bank lead, no, they don't. The governments lead. And if the governments don't do what they need to do, nothing will happen. And I did this for Power Africa for 7 years. I remember getting very frustrated that our progress wasn't going any faster. And a friend said to me, he's like, Andy, you can't blame yourself. You know, at some point, the governments need to do the things that they need to do. So even like to date, like it's been almost 4 months since the summit. How many of the governments have set up delivery units on those compacts? So we all need to pressure them to set up these delivery units. And we're providing funding to help them hire at least some of the staff to support these delivery units. We created a fellowship program through ODI, which has had a fellowship program going back for 60 years to make sure that there's at least some young professionals embedded within these delivery units, just to help make sure the paper's moving around and get everyone together. But the governments need to invest their own people, their own resources, and provide the political leadership on this. Otherwise, it doesn't work. And what I say to governments that aren't moving fast enough, I'm like, that's fine. There are more than 50 countries in Africa. If you're not going to do it, we're going to work with the governments that are going to move quickly and prioritize all of this.
Okay. Now, then directly linked to that, how then are you embedding transparency and accountability in this whole framework? Right? At what point do you say, okay, government, you're not doing it, we're moving off you, probably the funds may benefit another country?
Well, first, all of the compacts are publicly available, and we've got about 18 to 20 additional countries that are working on compacts right now. So if you Google Mission 300 Compact, you can see exactly what the compacts are. Then we're tracking progress across each of those reform commitments that were made in each compact, and we're tracking progress across the electrical connections as well. And then the World Bank itself is going to be launching a public-facing progress tracker that people will be able to look at on Mission 300. So to date, Mission 300 has helped over 23 million people get access to electricity based on these projects. We've got to increase our pace. We need 60 million a year. Now, not all 60 million. It's not going to be a clean 60 million a year because you have to get projects approved, money flowing. But we need to get that happening quickly so that the last 3 years, that's when all of the construction and everything's happening so that by 2030 we achieve these goals. So we have to just be vigilant about trying to be on top of any potential obstacle and delay.
Great. And now directly tied into our conversation for today, is there a technology preference for Mission 300? And from how you describe energy access?
No, it's technology agnostic. Look, do you care what's powering your light bulb right now? Does anybody even know what's powering your light bulb at the moment, unless you've got a solar panels on your roof? African countries, everyone, I describe it, and I heard this from someone recently, and I've adopted it, a best of the above approach when it comes to technology. What is the best technology for a country to use to be able to power its grid? Or in the off-grid space, clearly, where the grid's not going to be there for another 20 years or even longer, it's going to be solar. It might be solar with gas or diesel backup for a mini grid. So you've got to take advantage of the technologies that are available. But what's key to Mission 300 is Africa could be powered almost entirely by renewables. It's got wind and solar. That's great from an intermittency standpoint. But you've got massive resources of hydropower and geothermal power that serves as baseload. Potential for nuclear as well, not like immediately. So you have this tremendous potential for baseload as well. But if you had better interconnectors, better power trading, then you could have complete renewables. But in the meantime, you need fossil fuels. You need gas as baseload power. And there's abundant gas in Africa, and nobody's saying that you shouldn't take advantage of that.
Okay. I'll come, panelists, let me come to you. And Andy, we did this in Lome during the West African Energy Cooperation Summit. So asking our panelists, do you think Mission 300 will succeed? And after that, I'll come to you for your final words. Probably I'll start with you, Ebi. Ebi, do you think Mission 300 will succeed? And a simple yes or no is okay, and with a brief explanation. Ebi, I'll start with you.
I think it's unlikely to. And the reason why is because, to achieve its full amount, it will obviously do the amount.
Yeah.
The main issue from my point of view as to the failure of our energy systems, especially electricity, is they're not sustainable. And the reason why they're not sustainable is for purely commercial reasons. Whether that's an issue of the ability to pay, but the end result is the amount of payment that comes from one end is never really sufficient to compensate for the cost of energy going the opposite way. And that is a problem that really needs to be solved. Now, how you solve that, it is beyond Mission 300. But if the amount of money...
But Abby, I will say, cost-reflective tariffs are part of the pillar on it, but we all agree with you 100%. If we can't get countries to work towards cost-reflective tariffs, it doesn't work. So
okay, great. Thank you, Andy. Onyeka, from the SEforALL perspective, obviously you want this to succeed, but do you think it will succeed? Yes or no, and a simple and very explanation.
Yes,
Okay.
it is likely to succeed. I say this because I also work on a bunch of Mission 300 stuff, right? I mean, from the very onset, the concept around the technical assistance, as well as the recently approved compact trackers, right? I am part of the people who work on stuff like that, but I feel like it's going to work. The only question I really wanted to ask Andy was, I heard you say something about there has to be a drive to move from subsidies to actual sort of an electricity market that relies less on subsidies. Yeah. But then if you think about the whole concept behind the Mission 300, the funds coming from the World Bank, AFDB, just as a bit of a context, before I joined SEforALL, I worked on the Nigeria electrification project. Effectively, it was the biggest electrification project in Nigeria at the time. It was 550 million from the World Bank and AFDB at the time. And you would figure out that less than 10% of that entire fund was for management fees, but the rest just flew through subsidies, right, to private sector on results-based financing models, right? But the 30 billion. Sorry, the 30 billion, right? Yeah, so I just wanted to ask, that 30 billion is effectively going to go as subsidies, right, over the next 5 years.
So this is what I was getting at.
Private sector.
This is what I was getting at, and I wrote a blog about this recently. So I don't think, infinite subsidies are going to solve this, right? You've got to get this to where the point where private sector solves it, and it's reducing the subsidies. So one of the things I wrote a blog about was this idea of digital loads. Okay, if you've got a mini grid in a remote area, but it's got an internet connection from a satellite internet connection, there's potential additional offtake for that mini grid by doing crypto mining, localized AI learning, and localized data and local data centers as well, which produce income. So there are companies like Gridless, companies like Liquid Star, others that are looking at how can they earn extra income in a remote area that will help reduce the amount of subsidy that's needed and maybe even be commercially viable. So I think that as we watch this sector, there's going to be other offtake opportunities that may not eliminate the need for a subsidy, but even if you got the need for a subsidy reduced by half, that means you can reach twice as many people. There's more money to go around. So we have to watch this closely. But take a look at the blog that I wrote on this recently.
Great. Andrew, let's be quick with this. Will it succeed? And then I come to you, Felix, and then Andy, you can wrap up for us.
You know, we run into a problem because I think success, you're talking about the number of people connecting. We
Yeah.
have to look at the model of success differently. So if we look at it differently in terms of training, putting together those regulations that Andy's talking about and you, Seth, are talking about, and thinking through the compact with a light towards industrialization and job creation, yes, then it will succeed. But if we look purely at the number of people connected, Andy and I were talking about it. 300 million people is 60 million households. It's 1 million households every month. Let's not get fixated with the numbers. Let's get fixated with what happens as a result of Mission 300.
Okay, great.
Yeah. And if we wanted to just do it, we could just take a bunch of money, go out, buy a bunch of solar home kits, distribute them, and call it a day. But that's not what we're doing. We're talking about true economic transformation is what we're working towards.
Great. Felix, from the AU perspective, how do you see Mission 300's mission?
Well, first of all, I mean, I have to thank Andy for the work that he's doing, and Mission 300 is one of those. I would probably say I will not differ very much. I think from what Andrew Kamau mentioned, because for the most part, and I think Andy alluded to this. I mean, to succeed, we need a concerted effort. There is already an initiative that is being driven, but of course, member states, countries, that's what I mean, have a role to play. But also, when I pick a leaf from, for example, some of our flagship projects for Agenda 2063, like the African Single Electricity Market.
And Felix, for the sake of time, please be snappy for us so we can get to it.
All right. Yeah. So in a nutshell, what I'm saying is it is conditional. Succeeding in Mission 300 is conditional. I mean, everybody needs to play their part, but it's a good aspiration. And if you think about 1 million households every month, it is not very feasible if we look at it in a simplistic manner like that. But of course, absolutely, it's a good initiative. We are supporting it as AU, and we think that it's something that we should aspire to achieve by 2030.
Okay, great. And Andy, I'll come to you for your closing comments, but there are two key issues in the chat which I want you to address as well. I think Ledum says, with respect to Mission 300, could Andy speak to the roles of corporate entities operating in these countries and their contribution to supporting with the electrification initiatives? And I think he says he gets afraid when he hears World Bank and other DFI's involvement in the power sector in Africa, and because we've seen them, we've known them to be around for a longer time. And I think this question says, I work in the Nigeria electricity supply industry. What we lack is investment in energy and technology transfer. And maybe your final words, and you could quickly chip in on these.
Yeah.
Okay.
So my final words is, will we succeed? We will succeed if everybody is as much of a pain as I am and everybody pushes as hard as I'm pushing. That's why they brought me on. Because they know that I will be relentless in trying to push people to move faster. And that's what our team does. And not everybody likes it, but we can't do business as usual. We need everybody, the banks, the governments. We can't ask private sector to make investments that are going to lose money. We have to give private sector incentives to make investments. There's a lot of places in the world where they can invest. So you can't just say, private sector, why aren't you here? You have to give private sector an incentive to come. And governments can't change the rules of the game. And that's a key piece of the compacts as well, is making sure that there's an enabling environment for private sector money to come in. But we have to give incentives for private sector to make the investments that are necessary and create that enabling environment for them. So will we succeed? I think we're able to succeed. I think we're able to exceed the target as well. So 300, and my first year in Power Africa, after the first year, we tripled our goal because we saw that we were on track. And if we can get on track and stay on track, there's no reason we can't solve this whole issue. And the more that you do it, the more that you figure out models that work, the easier it's going to be to connect more and more people. So I feel good about it, but we all have to push really, really hard, because I would say we're on a yellow light. If it was a red, green, and yellow right now, we're on a yellow right now, according for my feeling, and I want to get us on green.
Great. Thank you very much, Andy, for joining us for this important conversation. We wish you all the best, and we know certainly it's going to succeed because we need the continent to electrify. Yes.
Great. Thanks so
And we're
much. Take care.
happy to have you stay on, or you could just jump off.
I've got to jump off. Thanks.
Okay. All
Thanks.
right.
Sorry.
Great. All right. Thank you, Andy. And panelists, thank you very much for bearing with us for this conversation. We are now back to a substantive topic where we now want to really explore whether we should be technology agnostic as far as energy access in Africa is concerned. So maybe, Andy, again, I'll start with you, but from your perspective, and generally you could chip in from this perspective, is it fair for the world, as far as our push for a climate resilient economy is concerned, to expect Africa to leapfrog fossil fuels, particularly oil and gas, into renewables? But where do we draw the balance? How does a balanced pathway look for African countries as far as whether go oil or go renewables?
There's no either or. You have to do all the above. You know, one of the things that people don't read reports. If you look at the IEA report on the Africa Outlook, they said pretty much that if Africa was to burn its entire gas reserves, which are substantial, cumulatively we would move from 3% contribution to greenhouse gases to 3.5%. So it's really, it's negligible. That's the first thing. The second thing is, those of you who live in oil-producing countries, you see flares. Gas is always being flared. It's burning somewhere. Yeah, and the reason why that happens is, of course, because if you have associated gas through oil production, the countries are told, well, you can either take your gas, which you don't have a market for, or we burn it and we produce oil. Yeah. Now, if we were to say, okay, no, in the production sharing contracts, there is domestic gas obligations. Let's find a way to develop this gas. Let's sort out fertilizer, for example, which Nigeria seems to be doing quite well, but everyone else needs to do it. How are we going to build these cities? By 2050, the population of Africa will be 2.5 billion. 13 of the world's 20 largest cities will be in Africa. Either they're going to be slums or we're going to build homes. Now, if you need to build homes, you need cement, you need steel, you need glass, you need aluminum, you need all those things. You're not going to build those things with wind and solar. I can tell you that for free. But of course, you know, we can have a hybrid system because we don't have a system right now that's widespread. Like Andy was saying, you can have a hybrid system where you have intermittence and you have base load, which is either geothermal, hydro, but definitely oil and gas will have to be a major player.
Okay, and I'll come back to you, but Ebi, let me come to you. From what Andy just mentioned, right? And I think, and you made reference to an IEA report, and I think IEA reports have also indicated that we've seen a lot of investment flows into renewables globally, and it kind of outpaced, I think over the last couple of years, that outpaced fossil fuels. How should we be thinking, you know, as far as our drive for investment is concerned? Here is the case: the big players, those with the money, mostly Western companies, are now all quote unquote being a bit more climate conscious, getting into the space of renewables. How do we strike this balance to be able to tap into, be it renewables or be it gas? But Ebi, from where you sit, where are the investment flows currently coming in as far as Africa's energy sector is concerned? You are muted, Ebi.
Yeah. You know, I think when people look at most of the data for renewables, it's smothered by what China is doing. Let's be dead honest. So China is 85% plus of renewables growth, even by itself. Now, you know, what does that mean for individual countries? You know, I perfectly agree that you should use whatever energy you have. And I think countries will use whatever energy they have. The issue comes when you're asking to borrow money to develop. And if you're asking to borrow money to develop, then you have to follow whatever that person is telling you. Neither China nor India really asked to borrow money to develop, and they have built even coal generation. So I don't think it's really an issue if you have the money yourself. Now, the actual price trends are as you're saying. And this goes back to what is happening. Renewables in dollar terms are getting cheaper. There is no two ways about that. And one way to look at that, even on a basis, is just to look at internal combustion engine cars against EVs. Green tech behaves like a consumer product. That price is coming down in hard currency terms. Now, does that mean it's affordable? I don't know, but that price is coming down. And what I think we are going to get over the long run, and this may not be just in Africa, is that the price of green tech will actually come down to a point that it will be the preferred option. It isn't the preferred option now. It wasn't the preferred option 5 years ago, but I think in 10 years' time, it'll be undecidable that it will be there. But that being said, in terms of volumes of power, especially, electricity can't solve everything. In any energy system, you need thermal power. Now, thermal power, i.e., if you're going to have all these mines, to actually process things and to change the states of matter, requires at this moment hydrocarbons. Yes, people may talk about hydrogen, but it really requires hydrocarbons. So there is going to be there. But in terms of electricity, I think renewables will, in 10 years' time, be the dominant.
And it appears you don't believe green hydrogen could be an alternative for hydrocarbons.
No.
Yeah.
Green hydrogen doesn't obey physics. That's as simple as that. You need more energy to create green hydrogen than you can ever get out of it. It's physics. Now, it doesn't mean that there'll be instances where you will use hydrogen, but as a massive, wide-range fuel, no, I don't believe in green hydrogen.
Good. I'll come back to you. Felix, from the AU perspective, what is the current thinking on harmonizing oil and gas development with climate goals across the continent? Does it play up in your work? Are we seeing continental shifts?
All right, thank you, Seth. Let me first things first. It is very important that I first start by making sure that I put the record straight that almost every AU member state is a signatory to the Paris Agreement. Yeah. What that basically means is that they have a commitment to decarbonization. But also what we see right now in Africa, the energy challenges, there are mainly two key energy challenges, and we have touched on them: access to electricity, access to clean cooking. These are our major challenges that we see on the continent. And so when we are talking about the position of AU in 2022, the Executive Council, which is comprised of the ministers of energy in Africa, they came up with a common position known as, the common position on energy access and just transition. The idea behind that is that, the continent is endowed with a lot of potential for energy and different sources of energy, which includes both renewable and non-renewable sources. And a lot of countries are dependent on non-renewable energy sources to meet their energy demand gap. Some of the countries, if you look at, especially the ones that are oil and gas dominant, you're talking about Algeria, you're talking about Egypt, you're talking about Libya, you're talking about Tunisia. Most of these countries that have energy, for example, electricity access close to 100%. Predominantly, they're using fossil fuel. So, but when you go to sub-Saharan Africa, of course, the story changes. And so from an AU perspective, our approach is that the continent must be able to utilize the available resources on the continent to meet and bridge those energy demand gap that we see on the continent, which means that the countries that have oil and gas, for example, even coal, can utilize that to bridge, because our concept of energy transition basically is getting out of energy poverty from no energy to energy. And the idea of transition actually didn't start today. We believe that transition started way back, from wood to coal. Then, we got into the much better fossil fuel, the oils, and then the gas. Now we are going to renewables, to greening what we are having currently in terms of our energy systems. And so the idea of transition is not new, but what the continent is trying to do is that we should have a just transition. And what does that actually look like? It's exactly what I've just mentioned to you. We want to move away from no energy into energy, and we want to use our available resources, both renewable and non-renewable. But I'll end with this. That doesn't mean we are not developing it sustainably, because at the basis, at the basic concept of the Paris Agreement was decarbonization. So what we are saying is that even when we are developing our oil and gas resources, we should do that sustainably. What does that look like? It looks like, reducing methane emissions, for example. It means reducing flaring. For example, it means electrifying our processes across the value chain. And these ideas and technological, implementation is being utilized across the continent. Take, for instance, the last statement I'm going to make. If you take, for example, just the East African crude oil pipeline that is being constructed between Uganda and Tanzania right now. They are looking at electrifying that pipeline using green electricity, which is hydro from Uganda and also Tanzania. Traditionally, we would burn crude in order to heat up that pipeline, as we allow the crude oil to flow to the coast. But now they're trying to substitute that. Those are processes of actually decarbonizing oil and gas processes, which is a sustainable development concept for the oil and gas industry.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Felix. But Onyeka, let me come to you. You are on the ground with renewables. What is the response to that? And what does the statistics tell you as far as oil and gas on one side and renewables on one side? Where do we see the balance from the SEforALL perspective?
From purely an SEforALL perspective, you would find out that electricity from oil and gas products, right, tends to reach a wider set of people. Of course, these are the technologies that power the grid, right? And the only problem is that on the renewable side, I know someone made mention of it earlier, there's that problem of affordability and willingness to pay. So yes, there's a power problem, but then there is an affordability problem, right? So, and that's where we come in. And not to also get it wrong, so there is infrastructure scale electrification, right? And there's small scale electrification. You find very few infrastructure scale renewable energy plants in Africa. They exist, but you could count them. What you find more are like the small scale renewable energy solutions, right? That fall somewhere within tier 3, tier 4 of the World Bank's MTF. So what we try to do is we try to stand in that gap, right? Through mini grids, standalone solar for productive use for businesses, essentially. I know most of the electrification problems are really not caused by the people. Therefore, their inability to afford it is not really their fault. But what we owe them is to sort of see how we can breach that financing gap between being able to afford this and wanting it, right? And that is what we majorly do. In terms of the scale of demand, trust me, it's tripled over the past couple of years. You find yourself going into communities where there's been renewable energy deployment, and you'd see members of other communities. The stories are the same in Sierra Leone, in Zambia, in Nigeria. You find other sort of communities coming to say, we need this as well. But the question then falls to, can you afford it? And everybody just goes back somewhat, right? So that's the place where it is now. Electricity from the grid, of course, you would always say it's cheaper because there's a lot of government subsidy that goes into that. But from the renewable energy side as well, we're now seeing a lot of government funding going that way to see how they can sort of subsidize the systems for people to get it. But would it ever match the electricity from the grid powered by fossil fuel or electricity from renewables? I don't know if that's going to happen, but let's see what the next 5-10 years will look like. I think that's what I would answer.
Would you say that the least cost, as far as thinking about assets between tier 1, tier 4 is concerned, will be renewables or solar home systems or mini grids?
Least cost would mostly depend on context, right? So that's one of the things that we do in SEforALL. We sort of support countries to design their transition plans, right? And most recently, we've just sort of supported the Nigerian government to now get to an ETP 2.0, which is now Transition Investment Plan, right? Just clearly saying how this thing works. So why I said it's country specific is that you'll find out that countries with very, very low access rates, you're most likely to see standalone solar systems being cheaper than mini grids, right? While in some other context, you find mini grids being cheaper than the standalone solar system. So it's context specific. You can't just use one umbrella answer to just cover for all of the countries in Africa, in my opinion.
Okay. Andy, let me come back to you. So from the conversation, and I think it's something that a lot of people kind of subscribe to is, okay, use the resources you have. But let's think about it from the perspective of finance, the volatility of oil and gas prices on the world market, and even the fact that for many African countries with the resource, the investment into oil and gas is actually owned by foreign companies here and there, where there's a lot of profit that goes back or outside from the country. But thinking about it from that perspective, should we really look into how renewables costs are plunging lower and rather prioritize, renewables as against oil and gas, which prices are very volatile, you cannot predict, it causes its own financial challenges for many governments?
Ebi said it. Look, he said, look, electricity is not the answer to everything. At some stage, you need thermal. So you can't say that it's going to be one thing or the other. And if you look at what's happening here in the US, what's happening in Europe, you get that feeling. Germany, after the war in Ukraine, went back to coal when they couldn't get the gas. If this whole paradigm of renewables was real, they would have just said, oh, thank you, Russia, we don't need your gas anymore. We are going renewables at 100%. We are now in trouble, so we're going to go that way. No, they came back.
But that would have taken time for them. That would have taken some time for them to get all the new renewable energy plants,
And they have the money. And they have the money. They have the money to invest. And they are now thinking about nuclear, going back to nuclear. Seth, the issue with renewables is this, and if you look at the compacts, these M300 compacts that were there, most of the countries, out of the 12 countries that put together the compact, 8 of them have said they want results-based funding.
Yeah.
Because, we have a problem. We can't afford the connection. Okay, then you connect me. You can't afford the electricity because let's say in a month it's $7. I can afford $5. You need to bridge me for the 2. What I would like to see is, even as I'm connecting you, what is the plan to give me a job that will allow me to better my life so that I can afford this electricity you're giving me? That's the plan I want to see. Yeah. And this is what I don't see. So if you look at energy compacts and you look at every country has a 5-year development plan, are they talking to each other? And so you've got the compact, you've got the development plan, and you've got this national determined contributions on climate. None of them talk to each other. They're all standalone. It's as if 3 different people put those things together. These things have to talk to each other. We have to decide, this electricity I'm putting in place, yes, it's for access, but where is the electricity for industrial development? Where is the electricity? And our hype, I hear about base these data centers. That's great. It works here in the US. They're called hyperscalers. But our hyperscalers are going to be cement, steel, agriculture. This is what employs people. We have a young population looking for jobs. This is what is, one of the things that I really liked that Nigeria did was, for the longest time, they were being told, substitute your standby diesel generators for solar. So I have a standby diesel generator. I'm supposed to put a solar panel and scrap my diesel generator. Obviously, that didn't make any sense. That's why it didn't work. So when the government said, no, we are burning all this gas, let's convert, instead of diesel, do compressed natural gas. Now that makes sense. Nigeria is not importing the gas. We don't have to import diesel. The gas is coming out of the ground here. We've already got the infrastructure. Africa has 120 gigawatts of standby diesel generation. I keep asking people, if solar was the cheapest form of electricity, why do we have so much diesel generation, standby diesel generation in Africa? We have to think about things in a logical way, rather than, I keep saying, it's a problem looking for a solution, not a solution looking for a problem. Yeah,
But
it's a solution.
maybe could it not be the case that the market has not been created, right? The ecosystem for, if you take countries like Kenya, where they are scaling renewables, and even their assets over the last period of 5 years has been primarily solar. How do you balance? And I'll come to you.
It's not true. It's not true. Kenya's renewables are geothermal,
yes,
and hydro.
Yeah.
And a little bit of solar, a little bit of wind, and and some thermal around. Because of the intermittence. And you heard Andy. Andy said for mini grids, it will be solar and gas or diesel. Because mini grids with battery, 24-hour battery or 12-hour batteries for nighttime, it doesn't work. It's too expensive. I see mini grids in Kenya. Mini grids in Kenya are charging between 30 and 70 US cents per kilowatt hour. Who can afford that?
Yeah. Anyway, Evie, so there's a question here that says, what's the way forward for government to support both fossils and renewables without creating conflict between them? And I think the person who has the question said, you appreciate your point about China and how it's strategically balanced fossil fuels renewables. So is there an approach for government to support the two without creating conflict? And AB, and please feel free to push in your questions. I think I'm now switching to the questions, and we have quite a number of them, and I'll make sure I go through all of them.
My view is government should support neither, and that's the problem. Government should allow just basic market forces to take effect. It's not a question of supporting one. What I meant by that is that whichever one works to produce on the grid by who's ever investing should be allowed to go on the grid. The main issue, though, is that the grid has its own problem, irrespective of the generation. And that goes back to the payment problem. So that, what it appears to happen is that above a certain size of network, we appear to have a problem policing behavior. And once that happens, the grid no longer works. So what you see is the generator works because I am the enforcer. It's a single user. It's between, as I say, me and my gate man. Once you get a grid above a certain size, it is very clear that the owner of the grid is not able to police it. So how that person generates to that grid is his own issue, whether it's renewables, whatever. The real issue to make power access is how do you police the energy that you produce and you transmit on the grid. And if you can't do that, you can't supply energy.
Felix, there's a question here, and I'm wondering whether you could have a bite on it. It says, how do we amend archaic contracts with global oil companies on the continent to harness the gas rather than flaring? Felix, you can answer that, but Ibi, I'll come to you. Looks like you smiled, so it looks like
Okay, well, that's a tricky question, but it's more like a commercial question. Let me answer it with a simple story. When I was in my geoscience class I was doing in my oil and gas class, one of the professors used to tell us that in the olden days, oil companies were going on looking for oil. And when you discover oil, you're happy. When you're lucky, you discover oil. When you're unlucky, you don't discover anything. But when you're very, very, very unlucky, you will discover gas. The idea there was that gas was the least valuable commodity you would go looking for, And in the oil and gas sector, we always say that even if it's a dry oil, it's still an important data set you've collected because we have stratigraphy there, we have sedimentology. We have a lot of data set we can still get from a dry oil. But why companies flare? Of course, it's because of the economics. I mean, they do not see when a company goes drilling for oil, they are not looking for gas, unless, of course, the gas is in huge quantity. Take, for instance, even Tanzania's relatively delayed to start developing there, although they are now moving forward. We're seeing what is happening in Mozambique. Of course, Nigeria is a big boy in this with Algeria and the rest of these other gas-producing countries. Mauritania has joined, including Senegal. But the idea there is that the economics has to be right. Remember, for oil companies, they come in order to invest and get returns on their investment. So the investment must make economic sense. They're not there for charity, and that is why governments must be able to try and develop indigenous national oil companies to try and take some of these, local risks, but also can be able to flourish with little margin, and they have more to give back to the country than international oil companies who are probably looking for much bigger profits. That is why also the oil and gas sector does not develop very well, especially in Africa, without very stringent regulation. In jurisdictions where they can be self-regulated, concessions work very well. The reason we run a production sharing agreement predominantly on the continent is precisely because of that. And I believe that that question is more of a commercial question than really a policy one. Thank you.
Great. If you do have an answer to that, because I saw you smiled when I asked the question, also I'll go to Onyeka for.
No, it's probably best to move on. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Great. Onyeka, so there's a question in the chat that says, so we all import solar models and wind generators in Africa, right? So, but how is SEforALL pushing for investment to localize the manufacturing in Africa, which I believe would be very essential if we want to scale up, any form of technology or industry in Africa. So, Onyeka, that's the question for you.
Yes, question. So, in the course of implementing projects, right, we just discovered that as a huge gap. You find developers saying they could not meet the project timelines because of importation timelines from China. Sometimes it's like the China New Year holidays and nothing moves, nothing comes to the port, etc. Then we sort of started reaching out. By ourselves as an entity, we naturally do not have enough finance to be able to support local manufacturing. But what we did was we reached out, and I think sometime last year, a program was launched, the Africa Renewable Energy Manufacturing Initiative, RME. So this is being done alongside Bloomberg, Africa Climate Foundation. It's just a couple of partners, right? So it's still sort of at inception phase, right? But there is a plan. So the plan is to mobilize enough finance, because we've already identified some of the opportunities, like countries that have the capacity to do like PV manufacturing, countries that have the capacity to do battery refining, battery part refining, etc. 5 countries have been identified for the pilot. So it's Nigeria, Egypt, Morocco, South Africa. I can't remember the 5th country, but like I said, it's at inception phases, and we're working with all of these partners that I just mentioned to see how we can draw sort of financing and just make the ecosystem valuable and sort of business friendly enough, for private sector to drive this, and not necessarily we telling private sector this is how you should do this. But there's a plan in place for that.
Okay, good. Andy, a question here directed specifically to you. It says, how can African oil and gas production nations reconcile global climate pressures with the urgent need to leverage their hydrocarbon resources for poverty reduction and energy access? That's a loaded question. I hope it's clear.
Why do you say it's loaded?
Okay, all right. Then just go ahead. There are multiple parts to it, yes.
Yeah, there are multiple parts to it. I think one of the things that I agree that we need to be better at negotiating. First of all, the production sharing contracts. That's the first thing. The second thing is once we have negotiated, we need to be able to enforce them. You see, all these companies, all these multinationals that operate in Africa have all signed the methane abatement protocols that were there in climate. But you ask them, so why are you still flaring in Africa? Well, the gas doesn't belong to us. It belongs to the government. If you look at production sharing contracts, the gas belongs to the government. The oil belongs to the share between them as a contractor and the government. So they don't count the gas as part of their greenhouse gas emissions protocol. So it's not part of their thing. But somewhere the world has to begin to hold them accountable and say, if you continue to flare, we will count this into your account. And the penalty is such that it's cheaper for them to invest in country because the requirement is there. I mean, the gas requirement is there in countries for people. I mean, we are all energy poor. We need to be able to figure this out even as we do our national determined contributions, even as we negotiate with climate bodies, but we are very poor at doing it, as African countries. We really need to figure out how we work together, and with Felix at the Africa Union, we need to work together to have a common position.
I think one key issue that when we talk about fossil fuel thermal plants, that it's in terms of its comparison with, let's say, a 300 megawatts wind power plant or solar farm, will be the operation cost, which adds some form of value to the cost of electricity sold to people who use the electricity, right? And so in that case, you'd realize many African countries, Ghana, for instance, recently example, very struggling with oil imports to be able to power its thermal plant. In that case, what would be a policy recommendation to a government, where you have the opportunity to tap into renewables, first of all, health-wise, climate-wise, you're good, or you still want to go into importing expensive oil that eventually adds up to a lot of operational costs in operating these plants. And Andy, you can take that other, yes, and I'll ask the same question to all the other panelists as well. What would be your recommendation in a government in that situation, right? Continue importing oil, very expensive.
Could I give a reply? I don't know.
If you go ahead, yes.
Okay. There's a similar problem. Like I said, one should always look at what's happening with cars. In cars, there is this battle between a carbon-based engine and renewable. Okay, and this, I believe, will come for other power systems, other energy systems. So we're seeing a fight now in one energy system, transportation, and we're seeing the balance of power. Now, Ethiopia, as you are aware, put a 100% tariff on internal combustion engines. That may not be fair, but the reason for that was to guard the central bank's FX. So this is what I think you're going to see playing out. OPEX on hydrocarbons is a dollar-based obligation. When I buy green tech, I spend more. Depends now. That price is dropping with a BYD car now coming towards $10,000. I now have a choice when I buy a car. Do I want to pay $10,000 for a new Chinese EV, or do I want to buy $10,000 for a 3-year-old Tacumbo Toyota Corolla? If I buy the Toyota Corolla, I have an ongoing OPEX cost, like you said, of the fuel.
Yep.
If I'm able to charge my BYD car at home off my solar panels, my effective cost drops significantly. But what I am playing with is I have still got $1 exposure to hydrocarbons if I drive the internal combustion car. That's similar to the issue that you may be saying with the Ghanaian situation. I think that green tech will take place because unfortunately our currencies are not that strong. And we either have a choice of paying more upfront in capex or having an ongoing obligation to a dollar liability. And I think for many people, as Ethiopia has done, at an individual level and at a corporate level, they'll probably borrow more money today to buy a piece of green tech than keep on paying dollar liabilities when their currency is halving every 5 years. And that is the advantage of green tech. It's not an environmental one. It's essentially a financing one, that I can lock in all my costs on day one, or I can keep on risking my currency against the dollar going forward.
A financing one with an environmental benefit, right?
Secondary. It's secondary.
Felix, there's a question here. It says you give an example of Uganda and Tanzania collaborating on pipeline electrification, which demonstrates cross-border energy cooperation. But how does the EU facilitate such regional energy partnerships, particularly between countries with complementary resources? And what role do regional economic communities play in advancing the continental energy transition?
Thank you. Let me just give you an example. 2 weeks ago, we just had a validation workshop and on the opportunity for expansion of domestic market for oil and gas and products in the Eastern African region. And we are doing similar studies in the other 5 regions of Africa, Southern, Western, Central. Of course, one thing which we are fairly always criticized about is, developing very good policies, having all these great ideas. And I think you mentioned that at the beginning, Seth. And when it comes to implementation, that's usually where, the real rubber meets the tarmac. What we do as an AU institution is to be able to design policies, do these studies, do these feasibilities, bring and identify where the opportunities are, the synergies within the region. I'll give you an example. What we found out in Eastern Africa is that the demand, for example, for oil and gas product, if you take the demand alone, it's an equivalent of about 416,000 barrels of oil equivalent per day. And that's for products alone, by the way. But we are all net importers, with the exception of, Sudan and South Sudan that are producing now. Now, in terms of refining capacity, we are only meeting about 5% of the, domestic demand, which means that the rest of the bulk of products are actually imported into the region. Now, what we do is identify these these opportunities. Take them to, with the technical people within the regions and stakeholders within the government, we take them to the political leadership, and then we ask the political leadership to champion this in order to ensure that they can attract our investment in some of these projects. Of course, as AU, we do not have the capacity to go directly and implement this project on behalf of the governments. What we do for the governments is to identify where the opportunities are, work with them to design policies and show them, look, you can do this, and this is possible. One of the things that we have identified in the Eastern region, for example, is the Tanzanian gas that can be able, in the long term, be able to be make the region self-sufficient in terms of meeting their, gas demand, even electricity from gas. But also we have identified opportunities for LPG, for clean cooking, so that it can be able to meet some of the clean cooking challenges that we see within the region as well. As much as most of the, the gas in Tanzania is actually dry gas. So these are the things that we can do, and we do this across the region. Right now, in SEDAC, they're working on a South African gas master plan. This is something that is supposed to be able to, sort of service the region with the gas from Mozambique. So we do this from a continental point of view to try and help governments to see where the opportunities are. And when we have done that, and we get the political leadership to buy in. Implementation is now supposed to be handled by the government, but we can be able to track some of the fundings, technical and financial support from out with the kind of concessions that we have. Lastly, we have seen this work, for example, with support from the African Development Bank. We see some support coming from the European Union, for example, with projects like the African Single Electricity Market, with the African Energy Efficiency Program, and so on and so forth. These are programs that are continental in nature, that we have done our preliminary work, designed policies, identified the opportunities, attracted funding, and allowed government to actually sign concessions for them. That's what we do at the AU level.
Great. And I'll be coming around for final words since we are almost out of time. But Onyeka, I think there's a question here that will best directed to you. It talks about why are we not supporting our own R&D to be able to generate our own tech IPs and eventually produce or industrialize some of these technologies here, rather than aiming to use or assemble what we just import from elsewhere. And is this something that is captured or part of the work you do at SEforALL?
Yeah, I mean, there's only very little non-government institutions can do, with regards to pushing R&D, as well as convincing the private sector to actually do local manufacturing, come up with different kind of IPs, technologies that are local, right? But I think what we do is we just sort of advocate for it, but we can't arm twist anybody really to do this. If you come to Nigeria, for instance, there's Naseni, and there are other private sector companies that are sort of doing solar PV manufacturing right now, some assemble as well. But the truth is, what technology do you want to sort of develop locally beyond what already exists, even within that renewable energy aspect, right? The technologies, they keep expanding and they just keep getting proof of concept. The PV panels, the batteries, the inverters, the switch breakers, all of these technologies already exist, right? What I think the question means is, why can't we manufacture these things locally, right, rather than assemble them? And the truth is, it's entirely up to the private sector to be able to do that. But what we do is we advocate to the private sector to be able to do this. That's one. Number two is we sort of use our convening power to see how investors can invest in standard ideas that make sense and are scalable, right? And then the third thing that we do is we also speak to governments, right, to make the environment friendly for business, right? Because it's one thing for you to have all of these ideas, for you to have all of the financing, but if the ecosystem just doesn't support growth of a business, there's really nothing you can do about it, right? So that's why I said sometimes we are limited as non-government institutions on what we do with regards to subjects like this. But what we do is what we know how to do best: advocacy, attracting finance, and just sort of letting private sector understand that if you don't do this, no one else is going to come save you, right? So that's what we're doing.
Okay. So in wrapping up, I think the message here has been quite clear and very vocal. We use the resources you have, and of course, there's many African countries do have the oil and gas resources. Some are also important, which they also need to really rethink how that factors into their financial and economic ecosystem. But Andrew, your final words, how can policymakers and regional stakeholders, we rethink the oil and gas infrastructure? Even if we ban all the ones we have, we may not necessarily make an impact on climate emissions. But how do we rethink the role of oil and gas infrastructure, such as pipelines, refineries, and how can they be economically viable to help us give us the assets we need for economic growth, and also being environmentally, critical about it as well?
One of the things that I'm actually heartened when I read through some of the things that are coming through on, these energy compacts, is the need for, one of the things is regional power pools. So people are actually beginning to think, we have to work together. I may have oil and gas, you could have hydro, somebody else could have geothermal, but together we really do have more of a renewable bend than oil and gas. That's the first thing. The second thing is we're not good at, for example, the West African gas pipeline. It has taken years to build, years. You look at, Felix talked about Tanzania and the gas. The study between Kenya and Tanzania was done in 2011. The MOU was signed in 2020. You've got Mozambique, and South Africa. Look, we are a massive market. I remember the acting assistant secretary for Africa in Abidjan last week saying that by 2050, Africa will be the biggest market. It'll be bigger than Canada, it'll be bigger than Europe, it'll be bigger than China. But it'll only be big that way if Africans work together and grow this African free trade area. Because, it's there. But you find people making strange utterances. I can't work with that country. I can't work with this country. It's not about whether I like you. Are we going to make money? Your money, whether I make, the shopkeeper down the road from me, I may not like him.
Yeah.
But he has something I want. And so we really have to work together and not wait for somebody else to come and do something for us. Between us, and I saw somebody ask about the Energy Bank, the Africa Energy Bank.
Yeah.
These are things that we can work together on. If people want to invest, come and invest. Let's first attract African investors, because all these people talk about foreign investors, foreign direct investment. There are a lot of people with money in Africa who can invest in the energy sector. The other thing that on investment side of it that is there, and I find so interesting here in the US, is the cooperative movement, the rural electrification cooperative structure. We have cooperatives for everything in Africa. We have cooperatives for agriculture, for public transport, funeral services. So why are we not in energy? Let's start somewhere. Start at home and then build it out everywhere else. Last point. I just saw that Norway came out with the largest tender for exploration of oil and gas.
Interesting.
It didn't make any headline. But people are going to spend more than $1 billion in Norway from this year. We should think about this. We need to have our own plan.
Good. Ibi, I believe you're very critical and still think that the dynamics overall over the next 5 to 10 years will favor green technologies. If so, how do we position our governments and policymakers to be well prepared to tap into the green technology space?
Okay. In one of my hats that I wear, I work for a group called the Africa Policy Research Institute. And we wrote a paper which we call the petrodollar versus the electro yuan. What that essentially says is that all of green tech is made in China. Let's just be frank. So if you are choosing to build an oil and gas or a gas IPP, you're funding yourself in dollars. If you're choosing to do a renewable energy grid, you're also funding yourself in dollars. But why are you funding the renewable in dollars when it's coming from China? And the reason for that is that 10-year interest rates in the US are at 4.5%. 10-year interest rates in China are at 1.5%. So for some reason, our developers are funding themselves in dollars to buy stuff from China that has an interest rate curve that's 3% lower. That's just due to habit. People haven't realized that China owns this market. And instead, what you can do is vendor finance. Okay, I borrow money in yuan, I buy it, you deliver it to my port, and I deploy it. But I now have to generate the local currency revenue, change it, hopefully with a central bank, and repay you back in yuan. Now, I think that'll be very big going forward, that a lot of the global South countries will realize that if they are going to go in that green tech direction, either by solar panels, battery energy systems, or EVs, that there's going to be a move towards renminbi green bond issuance to finance the purchase of what is essentially Chinese goods and services. I think that'll be the largest trend over the next 5 to 10 years.
And would oil and gas be a US trend?
Well, you know, that will go with the US interest rate curve. And if that keeps on going up, that's going to make oil and gas financing harder. I'm not going to comment where I think, I do have a view, but if you know, it seems to be going in one direction. And what, you know, you're seeing what's happening with trade. You're seeing this talk about nobody wants to own US treasuries anymore. Okay, so if the interest rates keep on going up, it's going to make it harder to finance anything in dollars, including, you know, hydrocarbon assets.
Okay. And Felix, so from the AU perspective, how should policymakers position themselves to really take advantage of their solar and wind resources, tap into the green investment into the space, while also harnessing their oil and gas resources in a just transition-oriented manner?
In a nutshell, really, I think we should be preoccupying ourselves on the continent. We cannot be burying our heads in the sun and fighting battles that are not ours. Our battles now is a battle of taking our people out of energy poverty into some sort of energy. And what I can only say as far as governments, maybe from an AU perspective, and if I had to advise any government, is to ramp up their renewable energy sources, especially where they can be able to meet, hard to reach areas. They have, rural and suburban areas in terms of clean cooking solutions. Because you see, there are problems that we have on the continent that you will not see in the US. You won't see it in France. I remember the first time I went to Geneva for a meeting, there was one of the meetings where they were discussing about standards. I mean, and this is no offense to anybody, they were discussing standards on protective gears for children's bicycles. Now, I grew up in rural Africa. I mean, why are you discussing about standards for protective gears for children's bicycle in the UN? I mean, to me, it made no sense. But it's a problem for a certain category of people in a certain part of the world. Yeah. And no problem with that at all. But you see, when you talk to my grandmother in the village, her problem is very different from the problem of a grandmother in Sweden. So from an African point of view, we want to move people away from energy poverty. We want to ramp up that electricity access. If we can get those 300 million homes up and running by 2030 with electricity, if we can get people to move away from biomass and at least to some form of a cleaner cooking method, if we can penetrate with LPG and maybe improve cooking stoves in rural Africa, those are the things that I would be advising the African governments to preoccupy themselves with. Of course, I will tell those who are producing oil and gas to ensure that they develop them sustainably. They must be able to adopt modern technologies of decarbonization. They should be able to fairly trade. Take, for instance, as I conclude, the new EU regulation on methane emission intensity by 2030. What does that actually mean? Africa exports about 18% of our crude oil into the EU market, 20% of our natural gas into the EU market. What that basically means is that if we cannot get those emissions down by the deadline that the EU has already put in place, we won't be trading with them. So if we cannot trade with the EU on our oil and gas, why are we producing? It therefore means you cannot bury your head in the sand and say, we will go business as usual. We will go with our oil and gas, but we'll do it sustainably. Those are the things I will tell to the governments in the continent.
Yeah, great. And I think that ties into the carbon border adjustment mechanism by the EU you're talking about, which is very important. Onyeka, so your final words, and someone is asking about where to find information about the RME program that you spoke about. But from where you sit as well, where do we draw the balance and how can we still electrify our people and making sure we are being environmentally sound and clear?
speaking here, I'm wearing my professional hat, right? And but also as a Nigerian, I'll speak truly to what I believe is true. The Energy Transition Plan says natural gas is the transition fuel, right? Use the natural gas because you have it, right? It's already a strong advantage for the country. So drawing that as an analogy, I'll just say countries should use what they have naturally available first, right? And then just sort of structure a framework for reinvesting the excess, right, to renewables for the last mile customers or the last mile end users, right? Because just like I said, the grid would never really develop at the pace at which we want it to, right? There would always be somebody in a very remote area needing access to electricity for something as basic as watching TV, right? Or for something as complex as making shoes, etc., right? So my point is countries should use what they naturally have an advantage with, right? Be it natural gas, be it hydro, whatever it is that they can do at the infrastructure scale, and whatever excess comes out of it, just reinvest it back into renewables. And the private sector as well should just stand at the corner and see how they can build these markets organically, right? Just essentially supporting both the local manufacturing, both the deployments, right? And I think there's also a core part. I mean, from summary of everything I've heard today, there's a core part where most of us can't really help, and that's government just sort of strengthening the economics of countries, essentially. If people have jobs, if people have skills, they would naturally at some point want to get electricity to either advance what they're already doing, right? And at that point, you'd see a lot of people go more towards technologies that they can afford, right? So I'll just say there has to be a perfect balance between how government invests in fossil fuel electricity infrastructure and how it happens for the renewables. But of course, we'll see how that happens.
Great. Panelists, thank you very much for this insightful and wonderful discussion. I believe it's been a great learning point for all of us, and I think there's a synergy and coherence in how we are thinking along the lines of the energy access and energy drive and investment for the continent, while also being a bit more conscious as far as the environment is concerned. So I'm really grateful for your time. And audience, thank you very much for your contributions. We enjoyed reading your comments. And now, if I wasn't able to read yours, apologies. It's just quite a number of them that I keep scanning through. Emanuela, back to you to close the webinar. Unless there's any final comments from anyone, if not, great.
Okay, thank you, Seth. So all too soon, we have come to the end of an insightful session that brought into perspective Africa's energy outlook and sustainability. And on behalf of the ACE Café team, I'd like to extend our heartfelt gratitude to our speakers, Mr. Felix Ocitti, Mr. Ebipere Clark, and Mr. Onyeka Okoye, Mr. Andrew Kamau, and Mr. Andrew Herscowitz for their time, for their expertise and insights, and to all attendees for actively engaging in today's important conversation. And as we wrap up, please note that the full recording of the session will be uploaded onto our website shortly. Additionally, a policy brief summarizing the key issues discussed here today and proposed recommendations will be made available in the coming days. So thank you once again for being a part of this impactful dialogue. We look forward to your continued engagement in our future events. Have a wonderful day. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks all.
Maybe I'll stay in touch. I'll shoot you an email.
Okay, thanks.
Great. Thank you
in
very
the corner.
much. Okay, bye.